welcome to the PRCA's webinar on the topic of exploring today's technology trends, how to communicate in a fast-changing world. This is a joint collaboration between the Tech PR Group and the Analyst Relations Group. I'm Nadia Nazar, and I'm the host of this session, as well as the co-chair of the Analyst Relations Group here at the PRCA. Our special guest today is Jane Wakefield, who is a former BBC Tech journo, now a technology freelance journalist, podcast host, consultant, and media trainer. And she'll be exploring the biggest trends today, from generative AI, such as ChatGPT and the Metaverse, to sustainability. Together with the PRCA AR and PR Group representatives, whom I'll introduce shortly, she'll talk about how comms practitioners can respond and share tips and tricks for getting attention in a busy marketplace. We'll also have time for an interactive Q&A with you, our audience. So any questions, please prop them in the Q&A chat and we'll be sure to get them responded to by the team. Okay, so before I hand over to Jane, let me take a brief moment to introduce you all to our two other speakers who'll be asking Jane about top tips for our PR and AR practitioners. And they are Will Cook, who is the Deputy Managing Director at Harvard, Tech Specialist Comms and Marketing Agency, and he's also the co-chair of the PRCA Tech Group. He has run global comms programs for the likes of Cisco, Salesforce, and Meta, but he loves nothing more than translating an organization's strategy into a media-centric storylines that will cut through the noise. And we'll be discussing more about this with Jane later on in this session. And we also have Claire Williamson, who's the Managing Director of Resonance, a B2B brand communications consultancy that works with game changers, rebels, and innovators in the tech space. And she's also chair of the PRCA Council and co-chair of the AR Group with me at the PRCA. Claire works with their clients using the power of data and insights to design strategic marketing programs and leans into a range of tools to execute, from media relations to inbound marketing. Part of the suite of programs run by Resonance is Analyst Relations, and Claire's passion lies in putting her clients front and center, getting under the hood of their drivers and developing strategies and stories that create impact. Analyst Relations is a critical piece of this puzzle. Bringing data and insights to other areas of the marketing and sales process is key. And we'll be discussing more on this with Jane later. So now I'm going to hand over to Jane, who can give some insights to our practitioners here. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Nadia. Okay, so I am just going to share my screen. And I've been asked to do several things in this presentation. So I'm going to dive straight in with the first slide, and I'm going to look first of all at trends that I see as being important. And I guess, you have to bear in mind here that I am no longer writing on a daily basis, so I'm not sort of entirely into the tech agenda. So a lot of these things that I've chosen are things that I've written about post the BBC. And I had a real dilemma on my hands as to whether to put artificial intelligence above the metaverse, because obviously it has now really taken over in people's consciousness. But I've stuck with the metaverse first because actually we've seen some quite interesting developments in this in the last few weeks. I suppose chief amongst these is Apple launching its VR headset, Vision Pro, which kind of really shook up the market, got everybody thinking about this again. As I say, it had kind of been overtaken a little bit by artificial intelligence, so it put it back in people's consciousness, and perhaps, it deserved to stop being hyped quite as much as it had been. The original hype, as I'm sure you all know, came about when Facebook changed its name to Meta and really started throwing all its eggs into the metaverse basket. Interestingly, now I think that Meta is talking up quite a lot of its AI tools, which are going to be designed to help sort of build these nascent virtual worlds. It's still kind of very early stages. It's still, nobody's really sure what it's about. It doesn't really exist yet, but there's lots of virtual worlds out there that are starting to build. And even this week, we've seen the European Union start setting out its vision for the metaverse. So it's obviously very aware that this is an important technology and something that it needs to get involved in. It hasn't sort of said that it's going to specifically regulate the metaverse as yet. A lot of the rules that it already has around sort of online content regulation will apply to the metaverse. But I think its key message about the metaverse is that it wants to create, if and when this is really a thing where we can go into these virtual worlds and start interacting, working, playing, educating ourselves in these virtual worlds. The EU has said it's very keen that we do that in a very open and interoperable way. So it's kind of hinting there that it doesn't want this to be dominated by big tech. Good luck with that, because every other technology that's come along has been dominated by big tech. But it's interesting that it's kind of putting forward its vision. Other things that have happened recently around the metaverse, Roblox is now going to be made available for the Meta Quest, which could be a very big deal. Obviously, Roblox is a huge game for young people. Meta's headset has been selling pretty well. It's fairly well priced at the moment, a lot cheaper to buy than the Vision Pro headset. And it's those kind of things, I think, those sort of starting to blend the sort of gaming landscape that we already know, the Roblox and the Minecrafts and all the other games that are out there into this sort of virtual world will be really important for the metaverse. So I do think that although it's been overhyped, it is very interesting to keep an eye on what's going on in that sort of space. But for people both on the journalist side of the wagon and for the PR community, you do have to do it in a very focused way, because it is, like so many technologies when they're in their very early stages, massively overhyped. So if you are trying to sell into the metaverse, be very clear about what it is that you're offering, and be wary, I would say, at this stage of using the metaverse. If what you're doing is something that uses virtual reality or augmented reality, then use that rather than metaverse, because people are getting a little bit sick of the metaverse basically meaning anything that's to do with VR or AR, when it, as I say, doesn't yet quite exist. My second kind of big trend for this coming year is artificial intelligence. And I would have put this up there even before ChatGPT came along, because we were seeing such huge leaps in things like medical tech. DeepMind was doing an awful lot of stuff that was really quite exciting in this space. But obviously everything changed with ChatGPT. We saw it reaching 100 million users quicker than TikTok had reached 100 million users, which kind of says a lot for the interest that people had in it. It was pretty much the first time artificial intelligence had properly come out of the labs and out of the research laboratories of the big tech companies and into our public consciousness. And it's obviously started an incredible conversation, not just around what it's going to look like, whether it's going to steal jobs, but also around data usage. And probably the biggest question when it comes to artificial intelligence, and the thing that most grips me, is its ability to spread fake news in ways we've never seen before. And again, there's been an awful lot of movement in artificial intelligence just even in the last few weeks. So interestingly, in June, unique visitors declined for the first time ever for ChatGPT, perhaps suggesting that interest is starting to wane. It's also now facing challenges from US regulators over claims it may have misused personal data and compromised people's reputation. So this is again very typical of new technology. After the initial flurry of interest in it and worries about it, then comes the sort of actual real questions around, what's it doing with people's data, and regulators start getting involved. We've also seen, I think it was this week, Elon Musk launching his rival to ChatGPT. As you probably know, he was originally part of OpenAI and then stood down from that. And he's since been very, very vocal about his fears over what AI could do when it starts getting smarter than humans. And he's now launched XAI, his own rival to ChatGPT. And tomorrow, in fact, if you're interested, they're going to hold a Twitter Spaces event. So you'll be able to hear a little bit more about what Elon Musk intends to do with that company. He's now got so many companies. I think he must be getting a bit busy, but he doesn't ever seem to run out of ideas. So it will be fascinating to see what he's going to do with AI. What he said so far, in typical Elon Musk confusion, it's going to be maximally curious, apparently, and pro-humanity. So if you're interested in finding out more about Elon Musk's company, then, as I say, listen into the Twitter Spaces event tomorrow. Other stuff that's interesting in artificial intelligence, Google's obviously rushed out its rival to ChatGPT, Bard, and that's just about to start rolling out in Europe. But in the US, where it was first tested, it's facing a class action suit in California. And this class action suit is claiming that basically Bard stole everything that was ever shared on the internet by hundreds of millions of Americans in order for it to be built. I mean, this is true. One of the reasons why AI and Google have started pushing out their AI platforms on the general public is because they've kind of run out of training data because they've already gobbled up everything that's on the internet. But it's interesting and very American that somebody has launched a class action suit against Google, saying that, you know, hold on a minute, can you just steal everybody's information and get away with it? We'll see. The other company that always interests me in this space is DeepMind, which is a London-based company and has done some incredible stuff with AI, specifically in the medical field. AlphaFold is enabling protein folding. Don't ask me to explain what protein folding is, because I really wouldn't be able to do that. But all I know is that it's an incredible breakthrough and is already being used by scientists all over the world. Interestingly, DeepMind has just merged with Google Brain. Obviously, it's always been owned by Google, but it's had an awful lot of autonomy and it's kind of got its own way with things. Will that still continue now that it's been sucked into the bigger Google ecosystem? Who knows? Sustainability is something that's been really interesting to me personally since I've left the BBC, and I am still writing, trying to write a feature a month for the BBC business pages, and quite a lot of them recently have been around sustainability. So I just wrote something about how AI is being used. Oh, excuse me. How AI is being used in waste disposal, and I've got a feature coming out next month, I think, which looks at fashion and how we can kind of start bringing tech into the fashion industry. And I think that, you know, sustainability is on everybody's mind at the moment because of global warming. Businesses have sort of certain responsibilities to meet certain targets. And I think there is just so much tech out there that is really, really fascinating when it comes to sustainability. My next pick is China. I was debating whether to just put geopolitics, because technology has become so heavily involved in geopolitics. But actually, I think China is interesting, not just because of the geopolitics, but also because of the number of incredible tech companies that are coming out of China still. And whilst there's been a bit of a hiatus on those, as we've seen this increasing kind of rivalry and breakdown in relationships between the US and China, and obviously we've seen the ongoing chip wars, we are also seeing them really, really looking at developing the same things that we're looking to develop in the West. I mean, AI, for instance. So I think China has just brought out new rules around AI. It's probably absolutely terrified about what might happen. It likes to control, as it, you know, technology companies very much that come out of China. It doesn't want them to be able to kind of start talking about anything that the government doesn't approve of. So it's very keen to clamp down on AI, and now any generative AI providers coming out of China will need to obtain a license to operate, which is fascinating stuff, I think. And then my final pick is health tech. I just think there's so much interesting stuff happening in this space. I was reading the other day about, I think it's Kidderminster Hospital is using VR headsets to calm patients down when they're given procedures for people that are scared of needles, etc. They're experimenting with using VR headsets, to the stuff I spoke about earlier, where artificial intelligence is able to kind of read through reams and reams of medical data. It's kind of coming up with solutions for cancer and other diseases much quicker than humans ever could. And then as well, we're just seeing this absolute huge movement of health onto apps and virtual health assistants, the number of mental health apps that are available out there. I wrote an article about whether we would be seeing AI used in health apps, because in some ways AI is a perfect companion for to talk to somebody about their mental health and learn about their problems. But again, it comes with its own issues. So I'm really, really fascinated by health tech. So yes, those are my picks. Other people would choose other things, obviously, but I do think that, you know, they're the most interesting to me. So the other thing I've been asked to talk about a bit is just the kind of wider landscape of tech news. So I thought it was worth just talking about some of the things that are currently disrupting tech news. I've put the pandemic in here because it's really, obviously we're very post-pandemic now, but it's still disrupting the way that we work. I feel that, you know, the way that people are communicating with each other, so the way that PRs communicate with journalists has changed. We're not going into our offices so much. We're not so easy to get hold of. So it's really affected those relationships and how you go about building those relationships. More importantly, I think, is the way that people are consuming news, which has just changed dramatically over the last few years. People are no longer going to the BBC News website as much as they were, because they're just scrolling through their news feeds. The younger you are, the less likely you are to go to any form of news outlet. You'll just get all your news from social media. And we really have to start thinking about that and how people are finding their news in order to really be able to reach new audiences and to get our news out there. We have to start being part of social media and thinking about other ways that people are consuming news. Trust in media has changed dramatically. Again, during the pandemic, we saw so much polarization in the way that people were thinking about COVID, but also other stuff. That conspiracy theories just seem to snowball on the back of anti-vax and things that you took it for granted that people thought the BBC was a trusted media platform, but then suddenly it was clear that people weren't necessarily trusting everything that the BBC was saying. And AI has obviously come in and disrupted that again, because very soon it's going to be nigh on impossible to work out what is true and what is fake news. You may have seen some of these creations, the Pope in a puffer jacket, Boris Johnson and Trump being arrested, that were all just created using the tools that are readily available and that you can use within 15 minutes to make your own image, and it looks very believable. And all this stuff is being piled out onto the internet, so we are finding it harder and harder to know what to trust. And I guess that's when the role of organisations like the BBC becomes even more important, because, you know, people do need to have something that they can still trust in. Although obviously the BBC is not having a great time at this particular time for this particular week. The cost of living, I think, is important, because we saw a lot of people in the media world start going to paid for subscriptions. And I personally think that people are going to not necessarily be able to afford to pay for news. So we've got to start thinking about all those news sites that are behind paywalls, how we whether that's something that's sustainable given the issues that we have in terms of the economy. And I've talked a little bit about AI, but there's other new platforms that people are using. The BBC has just launched a tech newsletter. Newsletters seem to be the big thing now. If you have a newsletter and you can pump it out and you can get sort of, you know, an audience of thousands to read it, then that's a really personal way of getting into people's inboxes, and seems to be incredibly popular. And we've seen people using designing their own newsletters. So Rory Kevin-Jones, who left the BBC, now has his own newsletter about health tech. Lots of journalists are considering creating their own newsletters and reaching people through that. But at the same time, we're also seeing organisations that are trying to bring back long form content, so big hitting long features on websites like Tortoise, and there's other new ones. I think there's lots of, I can't think of the name of the one that was set up by an ex-BBC person. Now it will come to me. But yeah, there's lots of these new platforms that are attempting to reach new audiences, like young people, which is getting harder and harder to reach, and to try and bring back the idea of longer form journalism, which has sort of got a bit out of the window as we all swipe through our phones and we literally only read the headline or the first couple of lines of a story. So trying to get that long read stuff back has long been a challenge. I'm going to talk very briefly about what makes a good story, and I've chosen these 3 stories, which are quite old, but I think they still sort of hold true. The first one was about the heat wave that we had last summer. We haven't really had that heat wave this summer yet, have we? Which is a bit of a shame. But I liked this story because it was a new take on it. So much of what we were reading last year about the heat wave was just about global warming and about the sort of the weather. But actually, this humanized it and was something I'd never thought about, which was how this affects people that are living in tower blocks and that don't have any sort of access to air conditioning, and they live in buildings where the heat rises, and so their flats are becoming like ovens. I'd never even considered that particular aspect of global warming, and I thought that was a really good human story. And one of the things that one of my big messages for today, I would say, is that what you really want from a good story is something that makes you go, oh yes, I hadn't really considered that. The second piece I've chosen is about a story that was an exclusive. So obviously we like these stories as journalists because there's something that we can sell that nobody else has. But I think it was a good story because it was something that everybody's interested in. Roblox was a huge game at this time. People were all talking about it. And of course, sex sells. And so if you've got something that's a problem, then people are immediately going to read it. This story did really, really well. And the third story I've chosen is about Bitcoin. Now, again, Bitcoin can often be written about in terms of the financial markets and its volatility and its regulation. And I liked this story because it was made very human again. It was about people who have lost their Bitcoin. Fortunately, it actually resonated with me because I was given a Bitcoin and I lost it. So maybe that's why I particularly like this story. But the point is that this was a way into a story of telling the human element of it. And when you think about something like crypto, you don't necessarily think of it as having a human element. So that's why I've chosen this. And if you want to kind of have a quick acrostic in terms of what makes a good story, and you'd like acrostics, this spells out truth, which ultimately is what we're all after. A story should be topical. It doesn't have to be all of these things. It should be at least one of these. It should be topical, something that's sort of around, that we're all talking about. AI at the moment, I suppose, in tech is the big topic. Relevant, and what I mean by this is if you are pitching a story, it has to be relevant to the audience. So what you might pitch to a small tech blog is probably very different to what you would pitch to the BBC, and understanding that relevance and the different audiences that read things is really important. A story that's unusual is always good. One of the top most read stories on the BBC website was about how Swedish women, when they give birth, are given a box for their baby. It's not unusual in Sweden, but to the UK audience, nobody knew about this. And this feature that was written about these boxes that were given out to Swedish new mums was the most read story on the BBC website ever a few years ago, and it kept on coming back into the top most read stories, just because it was unusual and it made people go, oh, didn't know that. We know that people love trouble, and that's the murders and the wars and the big kind of news stories. But in tech, it's the hacks and the companies that are kind of in trouble with regulators. Anything that's around, people struggling. Unfortunately, people do love bad news. But the most important of all of those ones, and the one that you should probably try and think about the most, is human. Just getting the human angle into a story is absolutely crucial, in my opinion, if you can. And it's often hard with tech, but it's always doable. How do you please a journalist? Well, I'm just one, and my pleases might be very different from other people's things that would please them. But I've just kind of sat down and tried to think about the things that I would like. Newsrooms are usually very busy in the morning. So if you're going to call, if you still have access to a phone and you still know people's phone numbers post-pandemic, then try and do it in the afternoon. It's probably going to be quieter then. Relevant emails, we'll talk more about this, I think, when we do our Q&A. But for me, it's about keeping it short and snappy and really trying to get someone's attention, and not just bombarding them with every single pitch you have, knowing when to send something and keeping it, again, trying to know a little bit about the journalist that you're sending it to, so that you're sending them things that you know that they would be interested in. Don't send press releases that would bore your grandma. I mean, I do get sent some really, really boring press releases, and I do wonder why anybody bothered. And, that's a shame, because somebody probably worked on that press release for a long, long time. But I'm sure that in their gut, they knew it wasn't interesting, and, try and make it interesting. Surveys, we'll talk about that a bit more later as well. At the BBC, we didn't really like surveys very much, but I know that in PR, surveys are quite important. So we will come back to that. But yeah, think carefully about them before you send them. Understand the site or publication. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to read the stuff, to find out a bit about the journalist. In the age of Twitter and LinkedIn, it's very easy to find this stuff out. Do a little bit of research. Be prepared to explain concepts. Journalists generally are quite lazy. So especially if you're talking about something new, quantum computing, the metaverse, whatever it is, if you're able to say, I've got somebody that really understands this, that's doing this 24/7, that's really gets this stuff, knows about the wider industry, knows all the gossip, be prepared to put them up just to give someone to give a sort of introductory chat to a journalist, because a journalist will remember that and will be very thankful for it. And probably the best thing that you need is to have a great quote, which again is something that's relevant, something that moves the story on, and something that has a bit of colour and a bit of life about it. Okay, that's the end. I think I'm sort of hitting the right sort of time. Am I, Nadia? I'm sort of talking into the space, so I'm hopeful that I haven't overshot my timing or undershot it.
No, you're bang on time. It's perfect.
Oh,
perfect. There you go. Perfect. Thank you so much. So everybody, don't know if you've been writing lots of notes about what's been happening with the tech trends at the moment, but I certainly was scribbling. There's some great stuff there. Remember your truth, and remember how not to annoy a journalist. Okay. Now, when it comes to a deep dive of what the perfect pitch is, okay, I'm going to hand over to Will now, who's going to come back on camera and come off mute, so he can talk to Jane about that perfect pitch in a bit of a Q&A session. Will, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nadia, and thanks again, Jane. That was really fascinating to go through all of that. Yeah, I think best place to start is, as Nadia was just saying there. You've started to talk about this a little bit already with the Truth acronym, but
yeah,
from your perspective, I'm sure you receive tens of thousands of pitches on a monthly basis, which probably is challenging to your sanity. From your perspective, what are the ingredients of a perfect pitch to catch your attention?
Well, whenever I answer this question, I'm always very conscious that I'm just one person. So I did a bit of homework for you. And I actually asked some of my ex-BBC colleagues, I'm not going to name who they are, but I asked about 4 or 5 of them. And I'm going to sort of run through some of their answers. So one said simply, and this person has gone on to work on newspapers, so that's probably why I just said exclusives. But, you know, that's a valid question. Another one said something quite similar, which was an email or a friendly DM. And this is quite interesting because it kind of talks to how you reach people as well. And they seem to be quite happy to be DM'd about a tech story that absolutely no one else is talking about. And the way that they would like it to be worded is, did you know this is happening? And it's significant because of X, Y, and Z. And we have these people that you can talk to. So that was their answer. And my favorite one came from an ex-colleague that you will all know. And they said, they gave it some deep thought, and they said, actually, the best way to do this is to get the PR person to ask the same questions a journalist gets asked by their editor, which is, what's the story? Why does it matter? Is it new? And what's the headline? And I like this answer because actually one thing I always say when I do kind of my pitching stuff and media training stuff is try and write the story. You know, if you think you've got a great story, try and write down, and I don't think you need to write a 1,000-word story, but write just 4 paragraphs of what it is that you're pitching and see if it makes a good story. So yeah, that was their thoughts, and I concur with all of their thoughts. 2 people said, didn't give an answer as to what they wanted, but they did give an answer to what they didn't want, which was surveys. So we've come back to that slightly controversial topic of surveys. But yeah, it has to be something that the perfect pitch doesn't exist, basically, does it? But what it is, that is an email that's short, succinct, and offers me something new. That would be my answer.
No, that's really fascinating. And well, it's fascinating that, you know, you picked a handful of journalists there, and they've all come at that from slightly different perspectives, and slightly things that really they like, and others prefer other things, which I think, yeah, demonstrates you need to get to know the journalist, understand what works for them, and then really tailor it in a human language. So that all makes a lot of sense, and I've been scribbling notes down for me, because that'll be hugely helpful in the future. I guess building on that, and you're talking about the story and giving that to the journalist, how much do you want that story finished when it comes to you? Or do you want the beginning, sort of a nugget or a perspective, and do you want to add your own layers, or do you want the perfect story boxed up? There it goes. There's your interviews. There's everything. Do you want a bit of autonomy with that?
Yeah, so this is interesting because now I've sort of seen it from both sides, and I can see that sometimes these pitches take weeks and weeks to craft. But actually, in a journalist's inbox, and Nadia asked me when we were chatting before this session, you know, how many emails I would get when I was at BBC, how many pitches I would get a day, and it's like 50, I would say, would be the average. It's a lot, you know. So if you think of it that way, and I'm quite a diligent person with my email, I do try and read everything. I mean, lots of my colleagues did not try and read anything at all and just deleted stuff. But, you know, if you think you've honed some pitch over weeks and weeks and weeks and months, and it's really, you've only got a couple of seconds for it to sort of impact the journalist that you're hinting at. So yeah, you don't need it to be, you need the nugget, because it's just sparking that curiosity, isn't it? It doesn't need to be well honed. You do need to be able to access all of that stuff very quickly afterwards. So I've sometimes said to PR people, oh, that sounds interesting, can I speak to this person? And they're like, they don't hear back from them for ages. There definitely is a huge mismatch between how quickly journalists respond to email and how quickly PR people respond. Like, journalists are working on, like, sometimes hour deadlines, and PR people are working on much, much longer deadlines. So yeah, I've got back to people and said, oh, can I speak to that person? And I haven't heard from them for ages. And then when I have heard from them, they offer me to speak to this person, like, in 3 weeks' time. It's, you know, it's like, no, now I need it now. So you need to have all that stuff in your back pocket, readily accessible. But I don't think you necessarily need to push it all out to somebody as a perfect package. It's just generating that curiosity. And one tip I would give is try and put something very general in the subject of your email, because actually what I often would do is the thing wouldn't be relevant to my daily news churn. But then if I was writing a feature and I'm searching for stuff, I would just put in if I'm writing a feature about Metaverse, I just put in Metaverse, and then anything that comes to me that's relevant to that back in my inbox, I will go back to. So if you want to sort of keep it sort of breathing and living, then give it a good subject that's searchable, that means journalists might come back and search for it in future.
Brilliant. No, that was really helpful. And that's actually just one of the, you answered the question in real time there, actually, Jane, that Emily
Did I? Oh, yes, look at me.
So that is, very impressive. That's really helpful. And I guess you started to talk a little bit to these. The dreaded survey's been mentioned already, but are there other, I'm definitely not one to put in the subject line, are there other sort of turn-offs for you, or things that straight immediately might make you hit that delete button?
Yes, you'd be unsurprised to hear. Op-eds, why would I want that? I mean, I still don't send them now. I'm a freelance journalist. What do people think I'm going to do with an op-ed? And an op-ed, for anybody who doesn't know, it's basically just an opinion piece that's been written by someone quite senior in their team. If somebody sent me an op-ed from Elon Musk, I probably would, sit up and take notice. But, for somebody in it from a company that I don't necessarily know that well, I don't really want that. And it's slightly insulting because it's basically saying that they've done the journalist's job for them. So, I don't particularly like those. Also, I get sometimes someone say, oh, would you like to talk to this person? And then there's a long list of random generalized topics that they can talk about. And it's, people want specifics, really. They don't want these general things. So that's kind of slightly annoying. And similarly, when I get emails going, so-and-so's in town, do you want to grab coffee? I'm being really grouchy here, sorry, but I'm generally it's like people are pretty busy, and if you've got something really big to sell, then sell it, whether your CEO's in town or not. The story is the story. You presumably will get access to those people via whatever methods you get them. So that although I still think there's value in building journalist PR relationships, that grabbing coffee with somebody just for the sake of it because they happen to be in town and that you can tick a box, I think is slightly old-fashioned, pre-pandemic.
Indeed. Yes, I think as comms people, we definitely realise that's evolved, that one. And yes, someone being over from the US maybe isn't enough on its own these days.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. And I guess we've already started to talk about this a little bit, but in terms of when we talk about AI and the trend of the moment, for you, when you say give me something new on that, is there particular things in your head that might mean, or that people on this call can be thinking about to sort of try and bring to you and other journalists?
Yeah. So it's kind of everybody has a viewpoint. Everybody's like, it's really exciting, but it's also really scary, and and future gazing about jobs and all of that anybody could do that, really. But what I really want is people that have practical experience of it and how they're practically going to use it. So how are they integrating it into their business? Are they using like the API? Do they need a new team of people to kind of do that? Do they need policies because they're aware that their staff might be in a PR company might be writing their press releases via using ChatGPT? How do they not necessarily clamp down on that, but how do they keep aware of that? It's stuff like that. It's practical examples of how people are using the tech rather than just the general chat around the fuzzy chat, which we've had a lot of and is really interesting, but I think you just want specifics now. Right, is how I would say. Yeah. I wrote a piece about the legal profession using AI, and you just want to hear from those law firms that are using it and what they're doing with it. That's what you want.
Got it.
And the same for any aspect of it, I guess.
Yeah. So less beliefs, more sort of action, ultimately.
Yes, exactly.
Got it. That's really helpful to know. I could talk all day here with you, Jane, but I think we're out of time from the PR side. So I'm going to hand over to Claire now.
Thanks, Will.
Just going to look at things through an AR lens.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Brilliant. So I'm talking from an analyst relations perspective and how analyst relations can potentially feed into media relations and create more success and more, land more pieces of coverage with journalists. So from the perspective of that, as a journalist, what role do insights from analysts and analyst firms play in your decision making for what stories to write, and how can they support the stories that you're writing?
I mean, they're really important in a story, because that gives you that neutral voice, doesn't it? And that person that's sort of done the solid work on stuff. So their stats and their kind of ideas about where the market's going are really invaluable. And funnily enough, analysts often give really bad quotes when you try and kind of, because I don't know, they're just difficult. They tell you loads of really interesting things, and then when you go back to your notebook and you try and turn that into a good quote, you're like, oh, that's a bit boring, and I don't know what to do with that. So a better quote would be good. But yeah, I mean, you just trust the big kind of analyst houses to really know these subjects inside out, because these people have specialisms, right? And so they're living and breathing this like on a daily basis, which brings with it a lot of trustworthiness. And yeah, so I love a good analyst chat.
Yeah, and actually just going back to what you said about, you mentioned you wrote a piece on AI in law, and speaking to the law firms was really important, and how they're actually using the technology. From an analyst point of view, obviously they're sat there talking to client buy side and sell side, so the vendors and the people using the technology. Is it helpful? Have you had helpful analysts describing use cases and case studies to you in the past, and is that something you would look for?
Yeah, and actually sometimes I would go to an analyst first, or an expert as well, in like, it's not always an analyst for me that I would use, but it's somebody that can just give me that, because they will tell you about a project that's going on somewhere that you didn't know about, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I'll write about that then as well. I'm mainly now writing feature stuff, and so I'm looking to try and kind of, I have the nugget of an idea, something that I think I want to write about, and maybe one story for it, and I'll need to expand that, because a feature you'll need 2 or 3 examples of things. And then if I went to an analyst and they're like, oh yeah, there's this project going on, I don't know, I used to write lots about smart cities, there's this smart city, did you know about this thing that's happening over there? So they're great at being able to kind of like get you to send you off in a different direction to where you thought you were going, actually.
Fantastic. And so you mentioned experts obviously are important to you from an analyst point of view. Are there any other characteristics you look for when you're assessing whether an analyst is the right type of analyst to be leaning into for your stories?
I mean, what you want is stats, good stats, hard facts about stuff is really important. And because you can Google stuff and you can find lots of stats. But so I was trying to find out some stats around waste for this article that I wrote for the BBC, and you'd find competing stats from the UN and the World Bank and various, and so kind of to have an expert that perhaps can help you put those different stats into some kind of, I don't know, I mean, they'll have looked through them all, you assume, and be able to give you kind of the best ones. So yeah, that's a really other valuable part that I think that they play in stories, to give you that sort of gravitas to it, because a few stats will always add a lot of gravitas to a story.
So, and you mentioned when you were chatting to Will there about surveys, and the fact that surveys aren't that, think about it before you send it. So obviously, analysts do research, etc.
Yeah.
So you would take you above and beyond a survey run by PR and communications. You'd take an analyst survey above that.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to sound like I really hate surveys, because they can be really useful. And actually, quite often I will use them in features that I write. It's more when you're being pitched them as being a kind of news story, where I find them a little bit like, you know, unless it's from Which or from Ofcom or from some really big kind of body, those aren't going to hit the news agenda, but they would definitely be helpful in features. And yes, if it's something that an analyst has done. But again, bear in mind that people don't have a lot of time. So if you're going to send an analyst white paper or say, oh, they've written all of this on that, you kind of want that summarized. And actually, the other day, somebody was telling me that I think it was IDC had written a big thing about smart rivers. And I'm thinking about doing something on that. And I went to their page and I actually found that they'd done a blog on it, which kind of summarized it, which I found really helpful because I didn't have to read the entire report, because at this stage, I don't even know if I want to write about it. I just want to sort of know what's going on. And in this blog, they kind of given some examples of some of the interesting projects that were happening in this area. And that then is really useful to me, rather than wading through a big long report that I don't know will be, you know, will have what I want in it and will take a lot of time to read.
Okay, that's a really interesting thought then. So because the papers can be 50 pages long.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess when you're looking at your features, and if you're putting a call out to your contacts for information on the feature, somebody coming back with, you know, a bit of information about research from an analyst firm, that's quite valuable then from a journalist point of view.
Yeah.
Okay, and okay, so talking about moving on into the final question I have to ask today, and then we'll kind of hand across to the floor for questions. The analyst insights or reports that you look at, I mean, obviously there's all sorts of different analyst reports, from, you know, the ranking reports, which is the Gartner Magic Quadrant, to the Wave, and that's all about the vendors and where they're placed versus their peers in the industry, which I'm sure is not all that interesting to analysts. What sort of reports are you interested in from kind of market landscape, etc.?
Well, when I used to work at the BBC, you would love reports that kind of ranked products and things. If you were writing about a new Apple product that had come out or whatever, those you could then sort of almost turn that into a table on the website. So they were really useful, product kind of placement things. And you know, similarly, if you're writing about search engines and, you know, the ranking, so those were great for when I was working and doing new stuff. Now sort of doing more freelance stuff, I think it's stuff that is about hard concepts. So if I'm writing about, and I do a podcast now where I've been doing I did a couple recently where I talked about quantum computing, something that can help me understand that would be really valuable. So the tables are great for new stuff, especially around products and around kind of understanding the market and who has market share, that sort of stuff. But I'd say, like, for me now, it's more around explaining hard concepts in an easy to understand way.
Yeah, and there's lots of hard concepts out there.
There really are.
Presentation proved. Fantastic. That's all of the questions I had from an AR point of view. So I'm going to hand back to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Jane.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Again, I've been scribbling lots of notes. I love these sessions because it's always good to learn. You never stop learning, and that's the main thing. So
absolutely.
I've got one for you, and I'm very conscious that you said something that probably I'd want to do as a corporate comms person in my other life, apart from being co-chair of the AR group here at the PRCA, and that is, you know, doing that lunch thing, Jane, you know, when the old execs are in, or, you know, in town, or trying to impress in-house people. I'm sure I'm not the only one trying to do that by saying, you know, look at the journalists I know, that sort of thing.
Nadia, so, I said coffee. If you're offering me lunch, I'm there. I'm there.
Excellent.
But
we seem
to have moved into a world of coffee only, and then I'm less keen on that.
It's as if you had, you know, the 8 coffees of the day, right? I see. Okay, so note to self on that. Again, I will adjust my notes. But what other advice would you give to people on this webinar looking to build relationships with journalists? You know, what advice would you do for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is harder now, isn't it? Because I think probably you are using the phone less than you would have been. An email is a fairly personal thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I guess it's events, isn't it? It's still going to events and inviting people. I make it sound like journalists don't want to go to any events, but you know, we're always up for a lunch, and and these networking events and panels and things. And you know, if you can host something that's going to be really valuable and teach somebody something, and it's hard because you put your neck out if you organize these events, and then if you don't get anyone coming to them, or you get everybody withdrawing from the last minute, it's a nightmare, I should imagine. But I think you still do need to find these events and networking things that you can do, that you can meet journalists, because I think it's only by in-person meeting people that you really get a sense of what they're interested in, and it's then that you have those kind of conversations that lead to something that perhaps, you know, somebody hadn't thought about before. You know, oh, did you know about this? And you're like, oh, I didn't, tell me about all of that. And you can't do that over email. So I think it's still really important to have those in-person meetups.
And that's really reassuring. And I'm going to be a bit controversial for a moment, Jane, maybe a little bit controversial. So this is, you know, obviously us different groups at the PRCA, we talk all the time. We talk about how can we help each other, work with each other. And it's great to see that, you know, building relationships with journalists, what's the hook, you know, what's of interest, you know, what's going to be in it, you know, for you as a freelancer, writing on various subjects, what's hot, what's not, etc. Some people have noted, and this is a question from Anonymous here, about on this, this is a person that said, we've noted when it comes to Gen Z, Gen Z journalists, that sometimes it's the younger generation that are reluctant to get out. And I'd like to add to that personally, that sometimes don't do the phone anymore, unlike maybe journalists towards my age group, shall we say. Does Jane find that from other journalists entering the industry, or are they hungry in a different way? What's your take on it?
I mean, so we had some very young people come and join the BBC tech team just before it moved to Glasgow. And they did do things very differently. But do you know what, we were doing everything at that time remotely. I felt very sorry for them because, you know, they weren't going into a newsroom. And so they weren't kind of getting that kind of team building thing. And I do think, you know, back to the slide I had about where I still had the pandemic on it, you know, we are still finding the effects of that because people aren't going into offices, and often it's interestingly young people that don't want to go into offices either because, you know, they want to save money, they don't want to travel. So it's very different, and I can't speak for them because I'm not Gen Z any stretch of the imagination. Right. So but yeah, I think that it's going to be very different the way these things work, because they've come into the industry at a time when we're all remote. Lots of things are still remote, so they've probably got that mindset, that remote mindset of not necessarily wanting to meet up and do things, and that kind of whole going down the pub thing has sort of died a bit of a death, hasn't it, in terms of, you know, parties and meetups with PR people. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is. Maybe that stuff will come back in time.
Yeah. Or is it that we have to be cleverer in the way in which we hook in, maybe in that remote hook in or hook up, so to speak, you know, the virtual beer or the virtual, maybe it's a different way of doing that. Virtual coffee, you know, is it another way that people should think to try and speak to and engage with journos?
Do you know what? I think probably the best way to find out if you want to know more about somebody is to ask them, you know, like, what could I do? How could I come and meet you, like, in your office? Would you be up for me? Just basically ask them how they would, you know, like to, because everybody will have a different answer, I think. But I definitely, I get that there's a distance now. We're all remote from each other, aren't we? I mean, we're not doing this in person, and everybody's got very used to the screen, but it isn't the same. But yeah, just keep plugging away via email. Try and build that relationship via email first, and then just simply ask the question, you know, like, how best to get you to meet my clients? Would you be up for this? I I think there's less money as well, isn't there? So there's less nice dinners around, and the things that used to lure us out of our offices and away from, and people are busier. I think that so many newsrooms now are cutting staff and cutting down. I know the BBC towards the end of my time there was cutting down on trips and going out of the office, which is such a real shame, because again, that's where you get really good stories, you know.
Yeah.
But there just wasn't the money or the time to do those things. Yeah. And I don't know what the answer to that is how you get either of those things back, really. Maybe it will all change when we get AI in doing the writing, and then we can just go out again and gather the interesting creative stories. Yeah, that's the dream, right?
Absolutely. And I kind of like that as well. But at the same time, we'll see what happens. Jane, I'm very conscious we're coming up to time, and it'd be great if you could just do a bit of a key takeaway summary before I then wrap it up. How about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think of all the things I've said that I want to sort of reiterate, it would be try and write your stories. You know, if you've got a good pitch, try and think, put your journalist head on for a minute and try and work out how you would do that. Does it make a good story? Even if you just think of what the headline might be, you know, you've got to put yourself in that position of the journalist. I would say try and make your stories as human as possible. Always try and find the human angle, the case study, the thing that kind of really brings it to life from a human perspective, because that's what we all really care about. And yeah, I mean, to your final question about relationships, it is really important to build these relationships. And I haven't really got the answer as to how you do that. And everybody is different, but, you know, keep trying, because it will only be through creating those, you know, almost personal relationships with journalists that you'll really get the most out of them. You can send as many emails as you want, but one meetup is probably as valuable as 100 emails. So however you find the way to do it, try and build the relationship, even if it's just with a couple of key journalists.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Jane. And really, really lots of things that I've learned today. What a great session.
I hope it was useful, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Jane. Really do appreciate it. And thank you to Will and to Claire as well for asking the questions too. And thank you so much to the rest of you for joining us today. And if you do have any other questions or queries, please do get in touch with us via the PRCA website or find us on LinkedIn. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to catching up with you super soon. Take care now and goodbye.
Bye.